What's going on, guys? It's Greg here, aka New York Prepper, and I just wanted to do a video on how to select a bug out location. So this bug out location could be a piece of property that you want to buy, or it could be a piece of public land that you may use to survive an SHTF situation. Either way, I'm going to discuss some criteria and some things that you should consider when you're trying to pick a bug out location, whether it's buying your own land or looking for public land that you can use. So the first piece of criteria we're going to talk about is the climate. So the first question you want to ask is, how long is the growing season? You want to know how long the growing season is, so this way, if you want to grow some food like different types of fruits and vegetables, you want to know how long the growing season is. If the growing season is too short, then you're going to be limited on what type of foods you can grow on your bug out location property. What are the prevailing winds? You want to know what the prevailing winds are because it'll tell you a little bit about what the climate is like in different seasons. Typically, if prevailing winds come out of the north in the wintertime, then usually that means it's cold air. In my part of the country, when the prevailing winds come out of the northwest in the wintertime usually, and that means that the winters are usually cold and there's a lot of influx of Arctic air. But especially you want to know how the prevailing winds are in relation to any nearby nuclear targets, population centers, or nuclear power plants. Because if, let's say, there's a big city nearby or some kind of power plant or industrial area or nuclear targets, if something happens, let's say there's a power plant melts down, or there's a nuclear explosion from a foreign country sends a bomb and they blow up a nuclear target near you, or there's some type of chemical leakage that releases toxic chemicals in the air. In all those cases, you don't want to be in the path of the prevailing wind from those particular areas, because it's going to blow all the fallout and all the chemicals into your bug out location. So you want to know where the prevailing winds are in relation to any nuclear targets, nuclear power plants, industrial areas, and population centers. So this way the winds don't blow any kind of toxic substances into your bug out location. Next thing you want to do is ask yourself, does it flood? Is it in a flood zone? Do you have a major river nearby? Is there a stream that floods frequently when there's heavy rain or heavy precipitation? Or if there's a runoff, when the snow melts in the springtime? Are there seasonal floods, when the snow melts? And, if there's a river nearby, does it flood into the area? Um, Another thing too is the drainage. If you have property that doesn't drain well, if you're like in a low-lying area, then in the springtime you're going to have a very difficult time keeping your basement dry if you build a structure on it, or you're going to have a hard time growing anything because there's going to be too much standing water. The soil is going to be saturated with water. So you want to have an area that drains water reasonably well. You don't want it to be a low-lying area, but you also don't want it to be in an area that's like on the side of a hill or next to like a steep slope, because you may be prone to mudslides or erosion, things like that. So, are there any avalanches, mudslides, or rock slides in the area? What are the temperatures like, and can you deal with them? So you want to get a feeling of what the average temperatures are like. What are the seasons like? Um, are you a cold weather person? Are you a hot weather person? Um, if, like me, for instance, I grew up in New York and I lived in New York my whole life, so I'm more of a cold weather person. So I prefer areas that have similar climate to New York. I prefer colder winters and more moderate summers versus, very hot summers and humidity all year round, like in Florida or Texas or someplace in the South. Um, so, if you're used to, let's say, very warm weather, it doesn't make sense for you to buy a piece of property in the mountains if you don't like cold weather and you can't deal with, snow. um, so you need to ask yourself realistically, what temperatures am I looking for that I know I can handle and that I have experience with. If you don't have experience living in a cold climate, and you buy yourself a bug out location, that could be a problem because it's a little bit of a learning curve and a little bit of adjusting when it comes to, keeping your house warm and your structure warm. Heating, um, clearing snow, things like that. If you're not used to it, um, then don't try to venture out of your native climate. What are the weather hazards? Are there hurricanes, blizzards, floods, tornadoes? Are there frequent droughts? Water is very important, so you want to make sure there aren't frequent droughts, or in an area, you don't want to be in an area where there's high probability of droughts. And can you use the climate to keep out unwanted visitors or trespassers? So, um, sometimes the weather can be a good way to keep out people from visiting you, if they're unwanted. So for example, if you have a bug out location in a very snowy climate, the deep snow is going to make it difficult for people to, have the motivation to venture out and, cross into your property, things like that. So that's something to consider. The next thing is geography and terrain. Is the terrain suitable for building? If you need to build different structures above or below ground, can you do so without bringing in major equipment and having to blast rocks? Is the terrain suitable for growing food and grazing livestock? Steep terrain is a drawback because typically livestock needs to have very flat ground for them to walk around, and also if you're growing any kind of food, you're typically going to want to have a nice flat piece of ground. You don't want to have very steep terrain. And the soils are important too. You need to have good soils if you're going to grow food and graze, have animals to grazing land for animals. If you have bad soils, then you're not going to have a good place to grow food. So isolated mountainous areas may not have the best soils, which is also bad for wild game and wild edibles. Typically, very mountainous terrain doesn't have a lot of small game or a lot of deer. Animals are just like people. They like to go to areas that are less harsh. They like to go to areas that have more food, a gentler climate, gentler winters. You're not going to find a heavy population of deer on the top of a mountain, that gets like, multiple feet of snow in the winter every year. They're going to be down in the valleys. So that's something to consider. And same thing with the soils. If there's bad soils, then there's not going to be good mast trees for the deer and for the local game animals. Like oaks and beech trees, things like that. Trees that provide nuts for wild animals. If the soils are bad, then you're not going to have good trees that will provide natural food for game animals. Is it near a volcano? You don't want to be near a volcano. Are you near a fault line or an earthquake prone area? You don't want to be near a fault line or earthquake area. That's common sense. Is there standing water nearby? So if you're in like a area where there may be like a wetland nearby, or like some kind of a depression or low-lying area where water collects into it, this could cause standing water, which is bad because mosquitoes are gonna make it their home, and mosquitoes create diseases. They spread diseases, so you don't want to be near standing water. then you also have to worry about leeches too. So definitely don't want to have any standing water nearby. And also, is it isolated enough and is the terrain difficult enough to keep out most unwanted visitors? So obviously you want to have a bug out location that's isolated and has difficult terrain. So this way, the average, person or the casual person is not going to think to go there. Same thing with any kind of burglars or marauders. They're going to look for easier terrain and less isolated areas that they're not going to have to really, work that hard for to get to those locations. And there's obviously a balance between isolation and difficult terrain with accessibility, because you don't want to have such an isolated area and such difficult terrain that you're not going to be able to get to it yourself when you need to. So you need to have a little bit of a balance there. It has to be just isolated enough and just enough difficulty to keep out most people, but you still need to be able to get to it yourself on foot or with a vehicle. So there's a balance there. Natural resources is the next third criteria that we're looking at here. And are there ample water sources, streams, lakes, ponds, groundwater, especially groundwater? Are the water sources seasonal? Do they dry up in the summertime? That's important to know. Is the water supply contaminated? It looks like I misspelled this one here. Sorry, guys, but you want to know if the water supply is contaminated. So the best way to do that is to look at historical documents. See if there were any kind of industrial areas in nearby, or if there were any kind of hazardous waste cleanup sites. Do a water test, obviously. Are your water sources downstream of possible contamination sources? So coal mines, power plants, sewage plants, etc. You don't want to have your water sources, that your main water supply for your bug out location, to be downstream of a major city or a coal mine or sewage plants or industrial areas, because if that, let's say you have a river and it's going right next, through an industrial area, if those industrial areas contaminate the water after SHTF, it's going to go right into your, that water is going to go right into your bug out location, and you're going to be drinking contaminated water without knowing it. So you don't want to be downstream of any contamination sources, whether it's nuclear plants, industrial areas, coal mines, sewage plants, densely populated areas where you're going to have a lot of, runoff, from highways, and, from people's septic systems are going to run off into the water. In the area where I live, there's been many lakes, actually, that lakefront communities where they had serious problems with the water because they built up houses all around the lakes, and all the septic systems from all the different houses, there's so many houses that would leak, and leach down towards the lake, and it caused the lake to be contaminated. So that's something you want to think about, is making sure your water sources are not downstream of any contamination. Food sources, that's obvious. You want to make sure that the area is rich with natural sources of food all year round. So that could be wild animals, game animals, and also wild edibles like, berries and, succulent plants. And really mountainous isolated areas may not have a lot of game or good vegetation. So we talked about that already before. Any other natural resources, if you're going to be picking a bug out location in a cold climate, you want to make sure that you have ample firewood that you can collect. You want to be in an area where there's enough tree cover, and so you can harvest, blown down trees or cut trees down for firewood if you have to. So firewood is a big consideration here. Lumber is another one. If you need to make your own lumber, can you do that? Any other kind of minerals that you may need, and rocks. Rocks are very useful. for a variety of things. You can use them to build different things. The fourth criteria is accessibility. Can you reach the property from your primary residence relatively easily by vehicle any time of the year? If it is too far away, it may not be desirable, as you may not be able to reach it safely unless you have a reliable vehicle and lots of spare gas. Even then, roads may become blocked by nature or man. Seasonal highways or mountain roads can become blocked by snow, and roads can wash out due to floodwaters. Um, so you want your bug out location to be accessible to you. You don't want to have it too far away, because if it's too far away, um, it's not realistic. If you, let's say, live on the East Coast and you have a bug out location in the Rocky Mountains, if SHTF hits, you're not going to be able to, it's very risky for you to take your family and all your supplies and bug out, 2,000 miles on the road, because you're eventually going to run out of gas. Your vehicle can break down. You could get ambushed. So you want to have your bug out location relatively close to your primary residence. You don't want it to be too close, but it should be close enough where you can get to it relatively easily by vehicle any time of the year, whether it's winter, summer, spring, fall. Um, and another thing to consider too is seasonal highways. If your bug out location is in a really isolated area, you may have to deal with, seasonal highways that are not plowed, in the winter time. We have a lot of those roads up here in New York where some of the more, isolated roads, they don't get plowed at all. Or they may get plowed like once a month in the winter time. So you definitely don't want to be located on a seasonal highway, unless you have a really good pickup truck and a plow. Human threats. Where are the nearest population centers? How big are they and how close are they? Ideally, you want to be more than one tank of gas away from a big city. If you're closer than one tank of gas away from a big city, then more difficult terrain or more isolated areas that require specialized vehicles or skills to get to will help keep away unwanted visitors. So you don't want to be close to a big city. You want to be far away from big cities, as far away as feasible. Um, the more people that are nearby, the more likely, you're going to have problems with them. Whether it's going to be trespassers, desperate people, criminals. You want to know also what the nearby towns are like. How close is the nearest town? Is it, how many people live there? Is it a big city? Is it a small town? You want to understand where the nearest population centers are, and you don't want to be too close to like a large town or a large city. You want to have some distance from any large, densely populated area. And, use the one tank rule as a rule of thumb. You want to ideally be at least one tank of gas away from a big city, because most people, if the grid goes down and SHTF hits, they're going to have whatever gas is in their car. Most people don't stockpile gas, so they're going to usually just, if they have to evacuate, they're going to have whatever's in their car. They may try to go to gas stations and refill, but a lot of gas stations will, get emptied out quickly. So the one tank of gas rule is a good rule of thumb. And if you have to get closer than that, then use more isolated areas, difficult terrain, and things like that, to keep yourself safe, from desperate people and hordes of unprepared people that may try to overrun your bug out location. The next thing is, where is the nearest main road or highway? You definitely don't want to be near a main road or a highway, because people are going to easily find your bug out location. Secondary and tertiary roads are the best. And off the beaten path, dirt roads, logging roads, things like that are obviously the best, as long as you can get access to it at any time of the year. And you want to know, what are the crime rates like in the area and in the nearest towns or cities. You want to know, how many murders there are, what are the sexual crimes like, are there a lot of rapes, are there a lot of, sexual assaults, um, what's the gang activity like, are there a lot of issues with burglary in the area or in nearby towns, because when SHTF hits, you're going to have to deal with all these criminals that are in the area. So um, you kind of want to get a feel for what the crime is like. And obviously, you don't want to be near a high crime area. Are there any pot growers, moonshiners, meth heads, druggies in the area? A lot of these types of people, they usually look into isolated areas to, let's say, grow pot or, make moonshine or, cook up meth or whatever kind of drugs. They usually pick more isolated areas so they don't get captured by law enforcement. A lot of those types of people are very dangerous, and you don't want to have, property right next to them. And you want to know, what do the locals do for a living? Are they full-time residents? Are they retirees? Are they seasonal visitors? And the reason why that's important is you kind of want to get a feeling for, um, are these people going to be a threat to you? If you have a lot of lower income people living nearby, there may be a chance that they could break into your bug out location. If, let's say, you have a cabin there, they could break into it while you're away and steal things from it. You kind of want to have a feeling of what the social economic status is of the people around the area, which will also determine if they're going to be a threat or not. And I'm not saying that poor people are more of a threat. Rich people can be a threat too, especially when they're hungry. Um, but a critical thing is, have there been a lot of burglaries in the area? And typically in lower income areas, you're going to see a lot more burglaries, and if you're going to have a bug out location, you don't want to have your bug out location broken into while you're away. And then, when the SHTF hits, you go there and everything's broken and everything's stolen. So you don't want to be in that position. Any other man-made hazards? What's the nearest nuclear power plant? You definitely don't want to be within 200 miles of a nuclear power plant if possible. In the East Coast, there's a lot of nuclear power plants, so that may not be possible. But you definitely don't want to be like less than 50 miles from a nuclear power plant if you can help it. Um, Nearest nuclear targets, typically these targets are missile bases, critical infrastructure, like dams or something like that, power generation facilities, big cities. Um, I wrote critical infrastructure twice by accident, but any kind of economically important area, especially military bases, airfields, airports, things like that. Those are going to be nuclear targets. You don't want to be near them. Um, the nearest active or closed industrial areas. So you're going to want to know where there's any active or closed industrial areas, because these areas may have chemicals that leached into the ground or are currently leaching into the ground, or they may leach into the ground after SHTF. Because you got to remember, after the power goes out, a lot of these industrial plants are, they're not going to be able to maintain certain processes that keep everything safe and in check. So once the grid goes down, there may be a lot of, chemical incidents. So you definitely don't want to be near an industrial area that's active or was recently closed, or because they could contaminate your air or your water. Um, are there any nearby hazardous waste or Superfund cleanup sites? You definitely don't want to be near a hazardous waste site or cleanup site. Are there any nearby prisons? If the power goes down and it's a long-term SHTF situation, I think that a lot of prisoners are going to be, set free, or they may escape because the government's not going to be able to, monitor all of them and feed them. It takes a lot of resources as it is right now during rule of law to, feed, clothe, house, and supervise, all the inmates in this country. So after the grid goes down, if there's like an economic collapse or an EMP, um, it's going to be pretty much nearly impossible to maintain our prison system. So that's something to think about. You don't want to be near like a big prison. And then mental institutions, the same thing. Mental institutions are, it takes a lot of work, a lot of resources to maintain a functioning mental institution with, really mentally ill people. And once the grid goes down, it's my opinion that a lot of these mental institutions will set people free, because they're not going to be able to monitor all of them and take care of all of them. So that's definitely not something you want to be near. And tactical considerations: is there thick vegetation or timber that can conceal structures? So you don't want to advertise your bug out location to all the neighbors in the area or the world. If there's like open fields or farmland, it may not be as good because you won't be able to conceal your structure or any vehicles that you have parked on the property. Um, and they can easily be spotted by aerial surveillance or nearby hilltops or any kind of observation towers or satellite imagery. Even if somebody looks up on Google Maps, they can see your bug out location if it's in like a clear cut area or an open area. Vegetation also conceals the smell of fires and visibility of lights. So, if you're running a wood stove or you're cooking food or you have lights on in your bug out location, the vegetation and the timber is going to conceal that, so people don't see it from far away. Versus if it's an open area, people are going to see the lights in your house or in your bug out location from a long distance away. Um, and also it'll conceal any kind of noises, so if somebody's passing through the area, let's say it's a group of marauders, and they're traveling through an area, um, you know if you're making noises, let's say you're splitting wood or you're running a generator, whatever the situation is, you're cooking food, there's lights in your bug out location. If you have a lot of timber, a lot of trees and a lot of vegetation, it may be hard for the marauders to spot that, from a long distance away. They're going to have to be really close to see that there's somebody there, and that they're not going to be able to see your bug out location from far away. Another thing is you want to ask yourself: is the terrain defensible? Will you be at a tactical advantage or a tactical disadvantage? Are you on the high ground or are you on the low ground? Is there suitable natural cover and concealment for creating shooting positions? Um, so that's very important. You want to be on the high ground if possible. You definitely don't want to be in the low ground. You don't want to be in an area where somebody can surround your bug out location with high ground. You don't want to be like in the bottom of a valley, because let's say a group of marauders comes up to your bug out location, they can surround it and they can stay up on the high ground and they can shoot down into your bug out location, and it's going to be very hard for you to effectively defeat them or escape. So you don't want to be in a low ground area. You want to be more of a high ground area or neutral terrain that's just totally flat. um, and then obviously you want to have suitable natural cover and concealment so you can create shooting positions, defensive shooting positions. Um, so that's one thing you want to consider: is the terrain defensible? Oh, whoops, I made a mistake. I'm sorry. Let's go back here. Sorry, guys. And then how many roads or trails can access the bug out location? So less is better. You don't want to have too many roads or trails going through your bug out property, um, because that's just more avenues of approach that somebody can go into your area. So, if you have, let's say, one road or one trail or one driveway, that's the ideal scenario because, you can block it by adding a gate or cutting down some trees, or if it's a trail or like a small driveway, you can cover it up with debris to conceal it. So if somebody's passing by, they'll think that the trail ends there or something like that. Um, so you don't want to have too many roads or trails that go through your bug out location or that can access your bug out location. And then finally, the last consideration is regulatory and political climate. Can you build on it? That's obviously, if you're trying to build a bug out location, you need to have approval to build on it from the local town. So that's important. If it's not approved for building, then that could be a problem. Can you put livestock there? That's also a local issue. Any other local ordinances or codes, such as open burning, target shooting. If you have a bug out location, you may want to use it to practice shooting or, to burn organic debris. These are things that you want to know about ahead of time before you buy your property. Obviously, you want to have a wood stove, especially if it's in a colder climate. But even in the southeastern United States, it still can get cold in the winter time. So having a wood stove has been very beneficial. And if your local fire codes don't allow wood stoves, then you're in trouble there. Um, and then gun laws, you want to know what the gun laws are like. So this way you can legally possess weapons there during rule of law, or actually stockpile weapons there. Any other kind of laws, that may affect your prepping. I know some states like California have a ban on generators, so that's something to consider as well. And also, you want to know if the people in the area are opposed to prepping and gun ownership. You generally don't want to be near people like that because they're going to report you to the local authorities if you do something that's not 100% up to standard. They're going to be watching everything you're doing, and they're going to complain, to the town about it, every little thing that you do. So, and if SHTF hits, they're not going to be on your side. They're not going to be somebody that you're going to want to ally yourself with. They're not going to be your friends after SHTF. So, and that's pretty much it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video, and don't forget the 3 P's: prepare, practice, and persevere. You prepare by storing food and water and critical supplies and gear. You practice with your critical gear and supplies, and then you persevere by being prepared and practicing. And remember, too, that SHTF is a mental game. So even though you have all your preparations, your food, your water, your guns, your ammo, and you've practiced with it, you still need to mentally persevere and um, you know overcome any challenges that come your way. And that's a mental game. You have to have the mental toughness to persevere through SHTF. So remember the 3 P's: prepare, practice, and persevere. All right, guys, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you liked the video, press the thumbs up button and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one. Take care. God bless.